Hello, my name is Adam Winrich, and this is a video about my whip collection. I made a video like this a little over 10 years ago. Back then I had about 50 whips. Now I've got 333 whips. I just got them all out and counted them. So the video is not going to show you each whip individually. I'll show you some clips of the piles laying out, and then I'm going to talk about 5 whips that have some personal importance to me, and then I'm also going to show you the 5 most expensive whips I have in my collection. So the 5 whips that I'm holding here are a bunch of firsts, you would say, and this one right here is actually the first whip I ever made. I think I built it in the years 1990 through 1992 because I kept rebuilding the whip because I couldn't get more leather. And at first it was just a 3-strand whip on a wooden handle. It still has the original wooden handle, but now it's 4-strand with some nylon rope in the middle of it. Let's see, moving on, another first. Here is a Hungarian pig drover's whip. This is essentially the first international whip I ever had in my collection. I went to the Boy Scout World Jamboree in 1995 and met some Hungarian Boy Scouts who gave me this whip. I in turn gave them a couple whips that I made. That one's pretty neat. Another cool first, this is the very first David Morgan bull whip I ever bought. I bought this from David himself back in 2005. I actually called David on the phone to make sure he was the one making it because I heard he had other people working for him doing the braiding and making the whip, so I wanted to make sure that he made it himself. So back then it was about $700, and I've used this one quite a bit. A couple other firsts. Let's see, these are a couple stock whips. This one right here is a 8-plat stock whip. That is the first whip I ever made in Australia. I've made a few whips in Australia now. I made this at Chris Barr's house on my first trip there in 2007. It's a 2-tone, 8-strand stock whip made out of kangaroo hide. And then this last one I'm holding here, another first. This is the first competition I ever won for making whips. I'll get a little bit closer with this one. I went to Glen Innes, Australia in 2009 and won their novice competition. I say novice, but it's still a really hard competition to win. This is a 20-strand thong, 7 foot long, and then a 24-strand handle. I put a lot of effort into this whip. I didn't make it in Australia. I made it right before I went to Australia, and I spent about a week making this whip. Even in the handle, I copied some patterns that I had seen in the whip making book by Ron Edwards. Here are the 5 most expensive whips that I own. First, I'll show you this titanium bull whip that I have. This was $2,600 back in 2010. I think when it was made, I believe it was the first titanium whip in existence. Now there's a couple more. I know at least one chainmail artist was inspired by a video of this whip to make his own titanium whip. See, up next at $3,000, I have a stock whip made by the famous Australian whip maker Cecil Henderson. Cecil Henderson made whips for many Hollywood stunt performers, including Douglas Fairbanks, who did some of the early Zorro movies. And a lot of whip makers my generation know about Cecil Henderson because of pictures of his very fancy whips in David Morgan's book, Whips and Whip Making. So yeah, that whip cost $3,000. So moving on to the last 3. I'll do these next 2 kind of together. These 2 are very fancy art whips made by Chris Barr. I think they were made about 2011 and 2012. One of them is called the Desert Mob, as it has a 60-strand handle with various desert animals worked into patterns in the handle. And then the other one is called the Myth Whip, which has like knights and skeletons and swords and wizards and stuff worked into the handle. I think this handle is also about 60 strands, and I think this part is 72. Each one of these whips was $4,500 Australian, and back when I bought them, that was about the same amount in American dollars, so I didn't really save any money. The exchange rate's definitely better at the moment for buying from Australia. And finally, the most expensive whip that I have, made by Peter Thorndike. This is the Man from Snowy River whip. This whip was $7,000 with a, I believe, 72-strand handle. He has a lot of pictures of this whip on his website. He also worked the name Man from Snowy River into the handle, and I've made some other videos about this whip. A very fancy art whip, and I think he's even made whips that are more expensive than this one right now. So these are all my expensive whips. I'm going to take all my other whips, the previous ones I talked about in this video, and these, find a dry spot of grass and crack them all. This is the first group of whips I talked about. Here's the first whip I ever made. Not a whole lot of taper on that one. Doesn't even have a platted belly in it. And then here's the Hungarian Pig Drover's whip. That one still cracks pretty good. See then my 10-foot David Morgan. I've made a few videos with this one back in the day, maybe back when I first got it. Still rolls out really well. And then finally the two stock whips that I made. This one I made at Chris Barr's house. That's a 6-footer, and then the whip that I used to win a whip making competition is a 7-footer. Now on to the expensive whips. Here's the titanium bull whip. Definitely not worried about breaking this one. See the Cecil Henderson stock whip. I'm not going to do any overhead cracks with this. I found with the older whips you're kind of safe just doing a real light overhand flick. Get a little bit of a crack out of it. As this whip would have been made at some point before Cecil Henderson passed away, I think was in 1963. So that means this whip is at least 60 years old, somewhere in there. Now we'll crack the two art whips by Chris Barr. So in whip making competitions in Australia, which both of these whips were entered into and both of them won, it's 50% graded on how it looks and then 50% on how it performs. So they all have to crack well. They can't just look pretty. Now I'll do a little cracking with the Myth whip. This one's a little heavier. And finally, I'll go ahead and do a couple cracks with the whip by Peter Thorndike, the Snowy River whip. I probably haven't had this one out and haven't cracked it in a while, but it looks like it should hold up just fine. Well, it's a little video about my whip collection. It's a little nuts. I'm definitely going to go back through it as I put it all away and pick some out to sell. My name is Adam Winrich. Thanks for watching.